Hello, good evening, and a warm welcome to this evening's BIC Streams session Data Development and Democracy. Today, we have with us uh, Pranab Sen, former chairperson of the National Statistical Commission, Sanjoy Hazarika, International Director, Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, data journalist Rukmini S., with Ankush Agarwal and Vikas Kumar. This session will be moderated by Manoj Panda, RBI Chair Professor, IEG, Delhi. The detailed bios of the speakers will appear on your chat boxes, and you may post your questions in the Q&A box that the panelists will address towards the end of the session. Do subscribe to our mailing list and follow us on our social media pages to stay updated on our future programming. With that, I hand it over to Professor Panda.
Yeah, thank you, Lekha, and a warm welcome to the distinguished participants. This is a virtual panel discussion on the book that has been released a few months ago by the Cambridge University Press. It's called Numbers in the Periphery, the Political Economy of Government Statistics. As the title suggests, it basically deals with certain key numbers in a peripheral state of the country, Nagaland. But of course, as they discuss, they do go to few other states also. But the questions, the more than the numbers, the problem with the numbers, they analyze in the broader political economic context. And it is here that possibly the main contribution of the book lies, apart from the fact that the authors have painstakingly investigated the data problem. It's not easy to go into the deep roots, but they have gone it over several years. I remember at least one of them telling me about 8-9 years ago that he had done a work on, he had done his first paper on Nagaland. I think with this brief introduction, I'll invite the authors to make a presentation of the book, and after that, we'll have further discussions. Ankush, you will start.
Good evening. Uh, we are grateful to all the panel members, Professor Sen, Sanjoy Da, Ms. Rukmini, and to Professor Panda, who is moderating the session. We are also grateful to BIC for organizing this event in the middle of the pandemic. We learned about Nagaland's data problems when Sanjoy Da interviewed Nagaland CM Neiphiu Rio in 2005. However, the work on this book began in 2011 when newspapers reported an absolute decline in Nagaland's population, and we interviewed Sanjoy Da. Later, during our fieldwork, we noted anomalies in maps and NSSO surveys and ended up examining the whole range of government statistics for Nagaland. The book is divided into 7 chapters. While the focus of the book is on Nagaland, we also discuss the shared experience of other states in the ethno-geographic periphery that overlaps with the erstwhile special category states. The existence of development and democracy deficits in the periphery is well documented. We argue that the periphery is also a site for data deficit and that the 3 deficits are intertwined. Uh, we noticed a lack of correspondence between area, borders, and territory. For instance, each map of Nagaland on the slide is different from all others. Both the number of incorrect maps and the degree of inaccuracy have grown despite advances in map making. This is explored in the first key chapter. We argue that errors in maps cannot be resolved through better survey methods or technology. The errors can be attributed firstly to political geographic factors, that is, popular demands to redraw artificial colonial borders that divide Nagas across states and countries. And secondly, to political economic factors, that is, demand in hilly Nagaland for fertile and resource rich plains territory in Assam. If these errors are corrected, the population density of Dimapur will drop by as much as 28%. Sandwiched between an irredentist insurgency on the one hand and the status quoist neighboring states and the union government on the other, the state government tries to play a balancing act that results in multiple maps as Kohima competes with insurgent countermappers. The next two chapters examine Nagaland's demographic somersault. As this graph shows, from being the fastest growing state until 2001, in 2011, Nagaland became the first state in post colonial India to report a contraction in population despite the absence of epidemic, famine, natural calamity, war, or any major change in its political status and socioeconomic conditions. We compare census with NFHS, SRS, gross school enrollment, electoral rolls, and church registers. As seen in this graph on electorate size and population, we find pervasive, large, and growing errors until 2001. Internal consistency checks reveal that Nagaland's population growth rate cannot be explained even if we assume zero death rate. We saw that the 2001 census overestimated Nagaland's population by at least 26%. Most research on census focuses on under-enumeration of the population headcount, whereas we present a detailed investigation into over-enumeration. While conventional demographic factors fail to explain the somersault, we find that political and economic factors can explain the anomaly. Overreporting was higher in areas with large share of remote villages and areas with demand for creation of new districts and constituencies, higher voting rates, and lesser ethnic diversity. The 2001 delimitation played a major role because, as shown in the graph, the size disparity between constituencies had grown enormously over the past 3 decades. Manipulation of headcount peaked in 2001 ahead of the delimitation and subsided only after 2008 when a presidential order postponed the delimitation to until the first census taken after 2026 and the population contracted in 2011. The last chapter focuses on sample surveys. We began to probe NSSO surveys after observing that the state had one of the lowest incidences of poverty, despite having one of the highest poverty lines in the country. Also, as shown in this graph, the consumption and income estimates of Nagaland are incompatible. A high poverty line should imply a high poverty rate and certainly not the lowest. We saw that this is an artifact of flawed sampling frame, biased samples, and non-coverage, that is, exclusion of the underdeveloped areas. Non-coverage accounts for at least 20% increase in MPC estimates for Nagaland compared to the national average. While discussions on sample surveys in the Northeast focus on sample size and sampling errors, we highlight the importance of non-sampling errors, particularly frame and survey non-coverage. Vikas will now discuss the insights from our research for statistical reform.
Ankush has discussed errors in various government statistics. Now, we find that these errors have been growing steadily in case of a whole range of statistics collected under the supervision of central statistical agencies. This fact suggests that similar problems could have affected other states as well. Indeed, we find serious errors in government data from Kashmir to Manipur. Smoothly varying national level data are often made up of erratic subcomponents. In the book, we show that no matter how we slice the national data, the errors are pervasive across subcontinents. In this set of graphs, we begin with an all India population estimate and then go to state and district, language, tribe, etc. But no matter how finely we splice it, we find that the errors persist all across. Errors also spread across the entire statistical system beginning from one data set and are also magnified in the process. To give you an example, the 14th Finance Commission's use of flawed the census data uh, translated into an additional devolution of 333 crores, which is about 80% of the state's own tax revenue. Such errors have distorted policy making across the country. Three shocks in recent times, demonetization, GST, and COVID pandemic, have exposed gaps in official statistics. Most discussions, however, on data quality focus only on the immediate problems. Our research suggests that statistical reforms need to take into account three key things. Firstly, the quality of a data set has to be uh, has to be understood from the perspective of all the stakeholders across the entire life cycle instead of firefighting an immediate problem at a particular point in time. Secondly, interconnections across data sets need attention because errors transmit across data sets. And thirdly, these interconnected data sets are in turn embedded in a social and political economic context. In fact, government statistics are public goods whose quality depends on the health of a larger ecosystem that includes RTI, CAG, media, the, the judiciary, academia, as well as the non-governmental think tanks. Now, when we see the problem from a holistic perspective, we find that data development and democracy deficits are intertwined in the country's geographical as well as social peripheries. And mere legalistic and technological interventions cannot address this data deficit. Now, if you go back to the maps and censuses of Nagaland, we argued that their quality cannot be improved without the resolution of the underlying political problem and the subsequent growth of the economy outside the state sector. And Nagaland's political problem is not merely limited to an insurgency. At stake is constitutional federalism and scalar politics of New Delhi. Right. So we often try to reduce the entire problem to insurgency and headcounts here and there, but actually it's a much deeper problem. And until we resolve that, the insurgency continue. And similarly, we also need to take into account the fact that the Naga people are also grappling with their inconclusive and deeply divisive search for, for common identity. They are searching answers to questions such as who is a Naga and what are his territorial entitlements. Now, until the political problem is resolved, we argue that the state's border will remain indeterminate internally as well as external borders, and it would be difficult to draw a quote unquote accurate maps of the state. Uh, Likewise, the economic problem of the state is about the search for a sustainable and inclusive growth that fulfills the contemporary dreams, but without too much reliance on the state. But this economic future requires decentralization, which cannot be achieved until the political problem is taken care of. Now, until the economy diversifies and the government institutions begin to command trust, which they do not at present, capturing the public pie will remain one of the most important lucrative economic activities, and state institutions will continue to remain the main arena of status competition between communities. Now, in this setting, winning number games is of paramount importance, and ethno-statistical entrepreneurs will continue to tap socioeconomic aspirations of their imagined communities to expand their access to state resources. Finally, I'd like to draw attention to two other aspects of the book. The northeastern region of the country has for a very long time been seen exclusively through the lenses of development and democracy deficits. We hope to throw fresh light by bringing a new lens, which is data. And secondly, our discussion offers a ringside view of center-state relations and also how the periphery views and experiences the Indian state. It also helps us to understand the expanding footprint of statistics in our public sphere. So we will, to some of the themes which I've listed towards the end, we can explore them further in the question answer session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ankush and Vikas. Just couple of points. In the 1950s and 60s, P.C. Mahalanobis, who is often regarded as the father of modern statistics in India, he used to describe statistics as a new technology. And that led to possibly the establishment of the official statistical system in India. The census, of course, is older than that. But the book starts with a quotation in the context of Nigeria in 1981, which says the census figure became strong political weapons. Now, if we take these two together, it looks like that the technology, of course, it has an impact on development, but often technology also can be used as new weapons to achieve certain goals, be it a particular ethnic group or the overall thing. So, since it can be used as a weapon, possibly statistics also is no exception. The other point I would like to say is, the manipulation process or the inaccuracies, inconsistencies in certain data, while for Nagaland, it is for some of the basic data like census or the monthly per capita consumption expenditure, poverty, as the authors claim. It is not that the other states in other spheres of data, there is no dispute. There are inconsistencies even at the aggregate level. There are disputes also. Now, depending on who is supporting and who is opposing the data use or how it is used or the conclusions they are driving to, people take very passionate views. What I liked about this particular book is the dispassionate analysis by the two young scholars. A third point I will say is, data, development, democracy, but the problems they describe that need not again be confined to democratic regimes only. In fact, in authoritarian regimes with a little bit of hint from the top, the distortions to data could be much more than what we notice in India. I think with these few remarks, I will now request Dr. Sen, the former Chief Statistician of India and former Chairperson of the National Statistical Commission, to speak. I had the privilege of working with him for a few months when he was Chairperson of the NSC, and I joined as a member towards the end of his term. Thank you, sir. Please.
Thank you, Manoj, for inviting me. May I first begin by complimenting the authors for an excellent book. You know, I have been working with data for a long, long time, and this is the first book which actually focuses on what is, as you quite rightly pointed out, Manoj, a fairly ubiquitous problem. Not only that, it's an extremely readable book. And you know, for two economists to write a readable book is a virtual impossibility. I don't know how Ankush and Vikas managed it. I suspect they were proofing each other's work and making it a lot more readable. But whatever they did, it's worked and it's worked brilliantly. And I would suggest that everybody should actually read it. It's a fun book to read. Now, having said that, let me move on to the substance of our discussion today. And you know, Manoj, you raised the issue that of data problems not being a function of democracy, right? That, you know, it's there very much in authoritarian states. The real question that you have to ask and we need to answer is there a systematic difference between data manipulation in democracies and data manipulation in authoritarian regimes? And let me submit to you that that is in fact the case. The objectives of all states are common in that every state, every government likes to project its achievements. The real question, because one of the things I don't think people realize is that the generation of data actually is targeted to particular audiences. Now, an authoritarian state will frankly not care about projecting anything to its own people because it doesn't frankly matter a great deal. But they do have a desire to project themselves in the eyes of others for a variety of reasons. But what is also true is that authoritarian states need to have a very, very good idea as to what is going on in their country. Otherwise, there is a tendency to lose control. Right? So the nature of data manipulation in authoritarian states is more for consumption, not of their own public, but of a larger setting in which the state is situated. And therefore it tends to focus. So it's much more of a PR exercise, if you will. The issue that I want to actually bring to the fore is that in the case of democracies, and even more so in the case of federal democracies, the nature of data manipulation would be different. So if we really take the work that Ankush and Vikas have done, much of their problems actually come up because of serious faults in two dimensions. One is cartography, but it's not cartography per se, Vikas and Ankush. It is how do you actually demarcate? I think the geographical characterization is probably not very inaccurate. It is how are you dividing it up? How are you describing the geography? Now, in almost all democracies, because of the way the seats in parliament or whatever is the representative body are divided, which is usually according to population, manipulation of census data is not uncommon. All right. Now the question is, and this is something that would be a fascinating study, whether or not the censuses pre-democracy were more accurate than censuses post-democracy. And that's an exercise I would dearly love to see. I suspect they would be. because there is an incentive in a democratic system to fiddle around with these things. The second element is the federal element, because in federal element, so any federal system, the demarcation of boundaries between states takes on the same level of importance that the demarcation of boundaries between countries take up. And we know what happens when we have disputes about our boundaries. We've got that problem on the borders of three of our neighbors. And something very similar would happen in the case of states as well, and for analogous reasons. So at the heart of all of this really is the issue of the population census. Now, if you think about it that way, when you move to other data sets, then again, Ankush and Vikas have talked about it at length. Most data sets are driven by using the census as the frame. Now, if the census itself is non-stable, then whatever samples you do and whatever data you generate from sample surveys will also be unstable. It cannot be any other way. So really the focus has to be the census. It is only after we establish that the census is stable, is accurate, that we can start passing judgment on anything which uses the census as a frame. And that is really a major part of the problem that Ankush and Vikas have been describing, as far as I could make out. So the focus then goes there. But there is an added dimension, and this dimension is, again, it's been talked about at length, is the dimension of the incentive structure facing those who undertake detailed surveys, and perhaps even censuses. But in the censuses, it may be less so, because by and large, censuses are conducted by local, whereas surveys are not. Surveys are usually carried out by people coming in from outside. But in areas which are disturbed, there will always be a tendency for field investigators and the supervisors to actually shun areas where they feel that the risk to their well-being can be adversely affected, particularly if they ask uncomfortable questions. And it is more than likely, in fact, I would find it very surprising if it were otherwise, that both supervisors and field investigators will tend not to go to locations, to a sample location, which has been selected independent of the safety consideration. But they will not tell the data system, as it were. What they'll do is probably go to a different village and say that they've been to the other one and give the data. And the data may actually be totally representative of the village that they have gone to. But it isn't the data that you want to be able to assess the state's level of development. Now that is something which is very, very difficult, or at least was, sorry, let me correct myself. It was very difficult to handle in the past. It is now possible to handle it if you use handheld devices with GPS, because you can actually geolocate where the data was entered. So that problem potentially can be reduced now. But the point is, of course, that assumes that you've got your original geolocations absolutely right, and that in of itself may not be the case until and unless this uh, geolocation, the coordinates are built into the census operation. And so far as I know, that is not happening. I may be wrong, the census commissioner may be thinking about it, but the fact of the matter is that unless you have the census which is geolocating, the surveys can still be manipulated. Now, this is an inherent problem, and this is a manipulation of the frame. The second level of manipulation happens in terms of the way the data is structured, or the data collection itself is structured. Now, there are questions which are meaningful and feasible in particular environments, but not so much in others. And sensitivity to that requires a sensitivity to not just the local geopolitical conditions, but also to the local cultures and the local taboos in terms of what is permissible in terms of information being sought. I think by and large, if you look at Indian surveys, they are all based on the kind of responses that are readily available in the heartland of the country, particularly the Hindi heartland, and may not actually be quite as suitable for other cultural contexts. The problem, of course, is that if you try to build in cultural context into your surveys, you may be jeopardizing the comparability of the data that you're generating. And it is always easier to argue that, look, we asked the exact same question and these are the answers we got. And so they are, ipso facto comparable. The problem, of course, is that they may not be, because the respondent is reacting differently to different kinds of questions. This, again, is something that changes with time. This is a problem that is not recognized. So as societies move, what is acceptable behavior and what is not acceptable behavior does tend to change. There is always an evolution that's happening socially. And for data collectors, this causes an enormous problem, because in order for them to be consistent over time, they have to be asking for the same basic information. But if the information that they are asking changes its character because of social and cultural developments, then the data, in fact, is non-comparable. So what I suspect that Ankush and Vikas have been picking up is this whole range of issues that come out of the fact that the collection of data and the desire to manipulate data are much, much more likely to be manipulated in democracies, and in particularly in federal democracies. And it is something that we have to be conscious of. And by the way, this is not a problem only with us. This has been a problem in the US. Similar charges have been leveled there. So the point is not that it happens. The point is not that we should not be deprecating this. The point is, can we actually find a solution? And that, I think, is much easier said than done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sen, for very insightful, practical points. Now, may I now request Mr. Hazarika Hello.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Chair.
Yeah.
I really appreciate this chance to share a platform with such distinguished figures as Professor Sen, yourself, Rukmini, of course, who's very well known for path-breaking work, and these two wonderful authors for their really path-breaking work, which, as Professor Sen said, is extremely engaging, a delight to read, even for somebody like me whose eyes roll over at the sight of too many graphs and statistics. Um, but it's edgy, it's robust, and it's challenges narratives. And that, I think, is the key, these three elements that they bring together. And they've done it in a state that I know reasonably well and love. The people there, many friends there, go back there time to time, not as often as I wish, but often enough. They've done it during a time of an insurgency. As Professor Sen mentioned, it's really difficult to do a lot of these exercises in times of conflict and when the safety of the individual data collector may not be assured. And these are researchers who've actually gone to the field, I know, and half the stories they have not told in this book, because they've also had some pretty harrowing experiences while collecting data. So I appreciate their courage and their tenacity in putting this together. I have four sort of points that I would like to share. I've shared the first. When the Shukla Commission report was put out in 1997, S.P. Shukla, B.G. Verghese, Jayanta Madhav, they pointed to four deficits in the Northeast. One was a governance deficit, one was a basic needs deficit, one was an infrastructure deficit, and a two-way deficit of understanding, both from, quote, the mainland, unquote, and the region we call the Northeast. I would add two. One is a trust deficit, which plays into the misunderstanding. But the other is, I think, critical, which is integrity. It's integrity of data, integrity of leadership, integrity of the abilities to speak your mind and share your views and challenge existing ones. And I think the social, shall we say, anthropology and political resonance of all this comes out in the book. A key problem, a key challenge is really that of manufactured concept. And the issue comes up, as Professor Sen has rightly pointed out, in a slightly different way, in context of data and power, of data sets and information, of, as Professor Panda pointed out, the weaponizing of statistics and data. I'm sure we'll hear a bit of that from Rukmini. And how is it possible that a state that reported an 85% increase or huge increase in population over several decades suddenly shrunk? It's like our economy has suddenly shrunk from whatever it was to minus 23%, or anyway, it's at a major, that itself was challenging, and that puzzled me a lot, because everything was blamed on illegal migrants and international immigration, and we knew who the villains were. I'll tell you a story, which is really the last part of this, because it's what nudged Vikas and Ankush to write this book. Correct me if the date is wrong, Ankush, because I think it was 2005. I was sitting with nephew Rio, then Chief Minister of Nagaland and now Chief Minister still with a little interregnum. Shows the longevity, not of ideas, but of politicians. a few weeks earlier, I had just led a major survey across the Northeast in 8 states, 120 enumerators, 20 civil society partners, looking at a visioning exercise. So what people wanted to see in 2020. Well, we're in 2020 and none of that is actually on the ground, but that's a separate thing. The point is that late at night, I got one of my chief assistant got a call from Nagaland. Now, in those days, 2004, 2005, you get a call late at night from Nagaland and you wonder what it is about. It's a matter of concern. So in the morning, he called me and says, sir, there is a problem in Nagaland. So I thought of the usual thing, extortion, somebody's been kidnapped. He says, no, nothing like that. He said, there's a problem with the data. I said, what's the problem with the data? He says, they can't do 10%. What do you mean they can't do 10%? 10% is the madhyam for doing a reasonable 10% of for a socio-demographic profile of a village or whatever. He said, sir, they're asking a question. I said, what? He said, what is 10%? How do we do 10% of 19? I said, what do you mean? He said, the census is saying there's 190 households in that village. There are 19. They've exaggerated everything by 10 times in some places. So then because I'd been hearing rumors about it, so then we had this. So I said, okay, let's change that, because if you can't do 10% there, then you'll have to obviously, do something else. But we have to go with 10% wherever we can. So then I was sitting across the table with the chief minister and said, I've heard this, what do you say? He said, it's absolutely true. He said, I have 5 lakh more people than I actually have. And I don't know what to do, because now we have to deal with accounts, populations, pensions of people that don't exist. So, and once Ankush and Vikas read that interview, Vikas came to me and had a conversation, and that's where it all started. So I always think it's a great story, because everything begins somewhere. It's taken them several years and a lot of hard work and foot slogging, literally, to do it, apart from data crunching. But I think the product is something they can all be proud of, because it challenges fundamental issues of population, not just population and data sets, but also of well-established scholars who have taken these data sets and perpetuated the myth and the falsehoods that exist. And that, I think, is really critical and most important. So I want to close here, Chair. I know you're looking probably at the time and at me. So let me just close with a few thoughts. One is that I think what it does is it challenges what you've done, Vikas and Ankur, is challenge the accepted narrative, especially at a time when you have something as sensitive in Assam as the NRC, which has just been done last year, and that has still not been, in a way, completed. So that is being challenged, because you need to look at three F's: figures, facts, and falsehoods, and what's politically motivated. And this, I think this challenge of the narrative of manufactured consent has been critical, and I'm very glad you've looked at issues of maps and cartography and the fungibility of borders. But I do have a question for you and for Professor Panda, which is that the periphery, no person believes they're on the periphery. Everybody believes they are themselves in the mainland, in the mainstream. They are not the periphery. So the periphery is also a perception. It is not a statistic, and it's not a demographic dividend either. So I'll just close with that, because Nagaland, as all of you would know, just like Mizoram, the Mizo Hills as it was then, the Lushai Hills, was actually one of the most NSM, or the most globalized places from the 19th century, with connections to the United States, UK, etc. The World War II came after that, and the World War One. So I think we have to challenge, and this is something that resonates with many people from the Northeast. What is the periphery? Who is the periphery? Uh, is the periphery Delhi? Uh, are we the periphery? What is the mainstream? Is there something called the mainstream? And these are issues which are really important to keep challenging, engaging, and addressing, because we do not regard ourselves as the periphery. We regard ourselves as the center of the world. I mean, that's unfortunately the case. And that's why in a situation like Nagaland, a political settlement is so critical to bringing some sort of a closure to the challenges and the problems that the people of the Naga Hills have faced for so long. Thank you. And close here.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hazarika. In fact, the last question you put about the periphery, that might exactly be the problem, part of the problem, at least in national integration. And how do we integrate the corresponding, a population that is possibly even more globalized than rest of India? These are questions that has to be answered by future researchers. But with that, may I now request Madam Rukmini?
Thank you, Professor Panda. I'm, really here as much to hear from everyone else on this panel as I am to talk about the book. My sort of connection with the book is in a way a bit of a full circle to Mr. Hazarika's story. So in February this year, I was doing some news reporting around the census in the context of the NPR, the NRC, and when I was trying to understand how good the census is at counting people, who it leaves out and why, I read a paper by Vikas and Ankush, and I got in touch with Vikas saying, I feel so embarrassed that I didn't even know so much of this about the 2001 census in particular. And he told me then how his own work had begun after reading Mr. Hazarika's interview. So their work then set me on the path of beginning to read about things that I had not paid that much attention to in the past. And one of the reasons I think that maybe I and maybe others have not paid enough attention to it is that when you see the sort of attack on institutions that's going on, particularly now, you start to cling to them. Sometimes from a place of knowledge, but sometimes from a place of pure faith. And what I find very challenging about Vikas and Ankush's book, and I always like things that challenge my way of thinking and help me move my thinking forward, is to try and think um, about where the cracks lie in institutions, what skepticism and questioning is justified, and where to draw those lines. So one of the other sort of odd connection with the panel is that the last bit of travel I undertook before, I live in Chennai, the last bit of travel I undertook before the lockdown was to Delhi. And at that time I was looking at what was going to happen with the census, with NSSO surveys, trying to understand just then there had been news reporting that had shown how the government had suppressed successive NSSO surveys, the attack on the Statistical Commission. And I was actually in Dr. Sen's office trying to understand what was going on at the time with the NSSO, what to think about, how to think about both the attacks and the way forward. So I agree with the panelists before who pointed out what a well-written book this is. In a way, it reads like a piece of investigative journalism, because what I've as someone who is both invested in institutions and invested in data, I push back against a broad-based skepticism of institutions and of Indian data. But what I do value greatly is specifics of what went wrong, why it went wrong, and then to think about how to fix it. And I think what one of the things that this book does is it doesn't allow for a sort of broad-based attack on, say, the census, right? One of the things that many of us were disturbed about when it came to the NSSO in February is that earlier in the year is that we agreed that there had been that there were problems with the NSSO. No one who works in statistics would deny that. But to then sort of get into the dismissive mode that supporters of the government got into when the government suppression of the NSSO was exposed by Business Standard, that is something we wanted to push back against. So I appreciate the specifics that the book gets into, the real, nuts and bolts. And the minute I saw, right from the beginning, when I saw that there were church registers that were going to be used as a source of statistics, I love innovations like this, which also really get to the heart of specifics of this. So I value being given a direction in which to focus investigation and attention without a sort of broad-based attack on institutions, which the book isn't doing at all. Um, One of the things that I found very fascinating about the book is to try and understand the political processes that created a situation in which these attempts at alterations needed to be made. And it immediately made me think about the other contestations around the 2008 delimitation exercise. I just wanted to draw attention to a fascinating paper I read, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, by Lakshmi Reddy, by Lakshmi Iyer and Maya Reddy around the 2008 delimitation. So what they found is that by and large, by using a range of indicators, by and large, they found that the 2008 delimitation process was uh, fairly politically unbiased. But the one large exception were the 5 MPs and 5 MLAs who were on the commission themselves. Their the redistricting and the reservations in their own constituencies were not did not follow the same norms of lack of evidence of political interference that was broadly seen in the rest of the country. So um, that too struck me as one of the examples of um, a very specific intervention on which to focus attention. Because again, if someone was to come to me with a broad based sort of attack on delimitation, that of course it's all politically done, that is something I would push back against. But I value a specific investigation as theirs was and as yours was. Um, so yes, I mean, I think also going forward, one of the things that it's going to be important to figure out how to think about is how do we think about things like the census, knowing now what we know about the ways in which political manipulation can work without undermining faith in their credibility, their integrity. And I don't want this to, I think something that happens sometimes is that in building up the integrity of these institutions, we dismiss criticisms. And this is something that, when I try and think about why it has been so rare to see such specific investigations of fraud, essentially, I do think that part of the reason is that, you know, there is an element of faith in this. So we do need to think about how we can balance these two objectives. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, which Mr. Hazarika is really the person to learn from, which is that when talking about areas, in this case it is Nagaland, but in general, I think this is something that many journalists might struggle with, is that if you are talking about places that are conventionally known as the periphery, you struggle with how to make points of the sort that Vikas and Ankush have without being seen or feeling as someone who's coming to it with a biased or unfair lens. So I have done very little reporting in the Northeast, but one of the things I reported a little about in Nagaland was women's representation in the assembly. I followed a couple of female candidates and tried to understand the environment around it. And I remember how nervous as essentially I felt about how to present what I was finding and writing about without being offensive, without seeming as someone who did not understand cultural sensibilities. So this is something to learn from Mr. Hazarika and others. But I also think this sort of investigation of the sort that Vikas and Ankush have done, sometimes one might be held back from it a little, from a discomfort about writing about marginalized people, people on the periphery, not wanting to add to marginalization. So that's as a journalist, that's another area that I think about. Um, Yes, and the issue of not just the census but the other surveys as well. Now, one of the things I find, so my sort of protocol usually while writing a news story is, if there's a big data set that's come out that encompasses the whole country, I have to pick what I want to write about, right? I have to pick what I'm going to, in a very sort of prosaic way, put in a chart, for example, to go with a news story. And I find that my mental thing has been to dismiss both the UTs and the smaller states as assuming that that any anomalies I find are as a result of poor sampling frames. I just dismiss the small states not out of a lack of interest, but out of a sort of certainty that what I'm seeing is sort of inexplicable. I even find this that find when I speak to journalism students. So I sometimes speak to students at the Asian College of Journalism, and I give them a data set and ask them to pick out a story from it. And they often, the tendency of journalists or journalism students is to pick out the exception. So they'll see something very exceptional in a small state and want to write about it. And my first response is, no, no, there's probably something going on in the data. Don't write about it. But it's just a reminder of how, by using this sort of lens repeatedly, um, issues with there's a reason that that row exists. It's meant to be part of analyzed information, but we've all grown used to just dismissing of those entirely, and that's something I need to rethink, and that's something maybe we need to make greater demands of, that in national data sets, having anomalies in small state data that make it impossible to report on should not be acceptable without a sort of lengthy explanation of why this is going on. Finally, I just wanted to ask, for your thoughts about it, and start a process of thinking about self-correction within systems. So in a sense, if you put together what happened in 2001 and 2011, do you sort of think of it as coming full circle, as a system self-correcting? Or, for example, if you think about the delimitation process where there were pushes and pulls, but did they sort of end up self-correcting? I was also thinking about it in the context of the US elections and this poll observer, which became a big thing. What in a two-party system, there are two parties poll observers who are both there to stand and shout if they see issues going on either side. So do we need to start thinking of a poll observer sort of model for enumeration and census exercises to sort of self-correct or balance out the system? That's the last sort of thought I had around this. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think the overall discussion from the three panelists have been fairly good. They have raised very different issues. And may I ask now the authors if they would like to respond to any of these points at this stage, or?
Yes.
Yeah, maybe then please go ahead. Yeah, Vikas, go ahead.
So there was a question from Professor Sen about the difference between pre-democracy and post-democracy censuses. We've got some evidence from Africa where they show that people, where scholars have shown that there in most pre-colonial, I mean, in most pre-independence censuses, there has been a massive undercounting, and there has been a massive overcounting in the first post-colonial census. And in case of India, which had much deeper local democracy compared to African colonies, the last uh, colonial census had a massive overcount in Punjab and Bengal, and the first post-colonial census then saw a correction of that. So, I mean, if you can equate the pre-independence as non-democracy, so we can say that even in those censuses, there was an undercounting, there was an error. So that is one part. The first question. The question that Professor Zarika asked about the periphery, we also struggled with a key phrase to use, and in the end, we settled with periphery because it perhaps best described the way statistical agencies engage or do not engage with those states. The political economy is such that these states of periphery from Jammu Kashmir all the way up to Mizoram, they fall in the uneven statistical topography of India. So the moment you leave the mainland of plains, our statistical agencies somehow feel that they are not as much answerable if there are some lapses here. They know that if they do an incomplete survey of Uttar Pradesh or Tamil Nadu, they'll be hue and cry in the Indian Parliament. However, they feel that if there is some lapse in the smaller states, there won't be much of questioning in Parliament or media. Also, you leaving them out will not affect the national estimates too much. So these states in a way are treated, effectively treated as being part of the statistical periphery of the country. So we did not really mean that they are periphery in the national main, life, but we meant was that they fall in the uneven statistical topography of the country where it is not politically expensive if you leave them out. So that was the question that Tukmani asked, about this self correction of the system. That's an extremely important question. Again, because we like to have institutions which will occasionally go wrong. Of course, there's no institution which can perform always correctly. They'll occasionally go wrong. However, they should have the capacity, internal capacity to come back to the usual state of affairs. In case of Nagaland, we saw that this was possible because of the unique social structure of the state. The chief minister called an all-party meet in which all church members, student bodies, everyone came together, and there the chief minister and his officials did not blame any community. They simply said that we've got a problem, and this has been going on for 2 or 3 decades. We have to set it right if we want to achieve our development goals. I mean, we cannot plan with this kind of data. So then they agreed unanimously. See, in Nagaland, anything has to be agreed by all, or it is not at all agreed upon. It is not about 51% people agreeing. Everyone from every tribal community leader, they signed on that piece of paper, and that piece of paper was then handed over to the census officials. Whenever in any locality things went wrong, they would simply call the person who had signed the paper, and then he would talk to his community, right? But this was possible because there was an officer called Hekali Zimomi who took the pain of canvassing the whole length and breadth of the state and convincing the elders, convincing people that they have to do it right this time. And always, whenever things went wrong, instead of invoking legal penalties, they would actually call the civil society people and say that, you see, that we had an understanding that we will not interfere in this thing, and now we see that there are some misgivings from the community. Can you go and talk to them? Right? So therefore, the self-correcting mechanism in case of Nagaland was possible only because the census officials understood the local culture and social structure, and they tried to work along with it instead of condemning the whole society. However, if you look at Jammu and Kashmir and Manipur, they have same problems, but they have not even had a single meeting or dialogue on this. We're not talking about consensus. They've not even have a single dialogue on this. So therefore, the self-correcting mechanism of these union level institutions has to be found locally. There cannot be a union level self-correcting mechanism. In every nook and corner, the local officials will have to find their solution, and then they'll work. If you try to work with New Delhi centric solutions, none of them are going to work in Jammu and Kashmir or Manipur. So that was the other question that Rukmani asked, was how do we think about census in such circumstances where we have seriously doubts about the thing? There are two answers to this. The first one is that human beings, when they make mistakes, when they make mistakes or when they falsify, they make it on a systematic basis. So to give you an example, in Jammu and Kashmir in 2011, a lot of people in the Kashmir Valley over-reported their household size. And when they were over-reporting household size, they chose to over-report children. Because in case of children, you don't have to make those many entries. Now, given that we are talking about an Indian, household, you're thinking about reporting, non-existing children, even the non-existing children that come to their mind is a male. So you see that the sex ratio of child sex ratio has a sharp decline there. So even though we begin with this and investigation where there are problems, but when we look it deeper, we actually learn more about the society, and we also we are also, after looking at the social structure and understanding the socio-economic context in which falsification has happened, we are able to clean the data and use it for subsequent analysis. Ankush would like to add something to the responses which I've given.
So I think by and large, okay. So I don't have much to add. Maybe I will take the questions from audience whenever turn comes or whenever Professor Panda permits.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Vikas and Ankush. One of the thing what Vikas is telling now is actually Nagaland did something marvelous. They could achieve consensus on how to correct the system. And possibly that is also because everybody recognized the problem and the leadership was able to convince all others. But consensus building is something possibly that even the heartland has to learn from Nagaland. Anyway,
I'd like to add a small
yes, please.
point here. The consensus seems to have broken now. So consensus is something which has to be built on a continuous basis. However, this time I think the consensus has already broken.
I see. And before, I'll open the floor now to questions. But before that, I'll put one question. One is technology that Professor Sen was already telling, GIS. But in that context, will AI, artificial intelligence, will it be able to solve the problem, or that might actually accentuate some of the problems? That is one question. The second one is, do we need an independent statistical commission which can actually force the government to do certain things that it recommends? I think with these two questions, let's open it to floor, then we'll come back to the panel again.
So,
Right.
Pardon?
something at this stage?
Yeah, you can.
we indeed need an independent statistical body, right? I mean, as things stand at the moment, and so that would be. I mean, I think most of us are going to agree on that point. But about the GIS and artificial intelligence, you see, human beings have. If you look at the papers, some of the literature on the pre-colonial censuses by Norbert Peabody and Sumit Guha and others, they show that even in pre-colonial head counts, if we use this word, there were manipulations. Right? So human beings have over the past 300 years, despite a lot of change in the conceptual background of census and the technologies, they have kept on adapting themselves. So it is not the case, so these are complex adaptive systems. It is not the case that if we introduce GIS, which will make it difficult, they'll find a newer means if they need to manipulate. So I think, we should definitely improve the technology. However, it is much more important to focus on building trust in institutions. I should trust, that the Census of India or the Election Commission of India is going to do a decent job. I may lose in a particular round, but on an average, I will, I'll get a fair treatment. So I think, the technology cannot replace the trust problem that we face at the moment.
Yeah. Dr. Sen, would you like to add anything?
Yes. In fact, I think the point that was made is a valid one, that there is always an incentive to manipulate. Okay. The GIS, what I suggested essentially as a solution to the problem, not of a deliberate manipulation, but because of fear factor, field investigators and supervisors selecting locations which they feel are safer and thereby completely biasing your estimates. The GIS can actually help you correct for it, because even if they don't actually survey that village, you can rework your statistics. But if you think that the data has been collected from that particular village, it's going to bias it. That's number one. Number two, AI in this context is extremely dangerous because AI is a self-learning system. And what it will tend to do is not just perpetuate, but possibly aggravate the manipulation that may have begun at a particular point in time. And so AI as a self-learning system can potentially create more trouble. I don't think there is a solution to ground truthing. No alternative.
Yeah, I think we would take the questions now.
Yes, we have a few questions lined up. We'll start with Mr. Narendra Pani. I request you to please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, and please try to complete your questions in within 1 minute.
Okay, I'm not a statistician, but I'm an economist who's been using statistics for about 4 decades now. And one issue that all those who use statistics come about is, are statisticians trying to look for the perfect data all the time? And as a result of that exercise, they don't distinguish enough between good data, bad data, and terrible data. Right? Would there be some way of evolving a method that can do so? For instance, just as you make a distinction between sampling and non-sampling error, can the non-sampling error be further divided into manipulated and non-manipulated error? And the manipulated error by the source of manipulation, whether it's by the state, the local interests, or by the people canvassing the schedules. These are not perfect categories, and if you look for perfection there, you're not going to get very far. But I think all of you, and maybe even some of us outside, are able to recognize the distinction between completely manipulated data and data that's more likely to be correct. So if there is some way of estimating that, however crude it may be, we would be able to ensure that we don't allow our search for the best to stop us from, to actually defeat our search for the good.
then shall I respond
Yeah, go ahead.
or should we wait for a few questions together and take them together?
Professor Panda, you need to unmute yourself. Professor Panda, you need to unmute. Thank you, sir.
No, then let's take another two questions and then we'll come back to the authors. or
Right.
the panel.
Next we have Mr. Gopal Pillai. Can you please unmute your mic?
Yeah, first, congratulate Vikas and Ankush for a wonderful book. I've not fully finished reading it because it did require some element of very slow reading to understand with all the bibliography. I asked basically a question from the administrator's point of view. I think the academics have a lot to study in this book to try and improve the data. But from the administrator's point of view, a lot of the information is available. And I'm just giving a specific example of, say, the border dispute, and you talked of 8 or 9 maps. I don't think it makes any difference if you have 9 maps or 20 maps. In the Assam-Nagaland border question with cases before the Supreme Court, we all know what the problem is. It's not anything new. But both the state governments of Nagaland and Assam, politically, they don't have the will to settle the issue. Otherwise, it's such a small issue, it can be settled without anything. But both sides feel that status quo is best, and therefore this matter is just dragged on and on and on. One last suggestion I have is, I think you mentioned in your book that the Aadhaar coverage is very low in Nagaland. And I think if you have 100% coverage of Aadhaar in Nagaland, you can possibly cross-check with many other data to see whether it is matching or not.
Okay, next question, please.
Anushka Ghogle. Please unmute and ask your question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. So I'm just a recent graduate, so I don't know enough about statistics, but during my thesis, I was working with the census data, and my objective was to remove the or sort of deal with the myths or the like there are certain things that the population we think about the population, such as the population is increasing rapidly and there is no stop to it. So we were working with these misunderstandings, and so the question I want to ask is, since the census data can be easily manipulated at each level, to what extent should we actually rely on the data? So because in an era where quantification is key, and the decisions taken in various systems and institutions affect daily lives, it becomes sort of like a dilemma. Should we rely on the data or not at all?
I suppose the panelists can respond to these observations.
Yeah, please, whoever wants to answer.
Maybe I'll add a few points and then Vikas.
Ankush, go ahead. Yeah, please be quick. We have several other questions.
Okay, sir. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for your questions. So Professor Pani, the problem with this quantification, as you yourself has pointed out, is there is no rigorous way of decomposing or quantifying these errors, and the statistical reason being, unless you know the true value, you cannot actually know how much is the extent of manipulation, and true value is not actually observed in most such cases. However, there are other ways. There are, for instance, internal consistency checks. There are external consistency checks, and through the use of different data sources, one can actually arrive at definitely some sort of lower and upper bounds to this manipulation. So Anushka, very briefly to your answer. See, at times, Professor Sen already pointed out that there are, always incentives to manipulate data. Now, there may not be entirely accurate data, and even a contaminated data may be useful, depending on your purpose. So the key here is to understand the context within which the data is generated, so that your further research and analysis is not contaminated. And in that and to that aim, metadata, all the definitions and the detailed reports that were used to be released earlier, at least, can help a lot. uh, mm, uh, uh, Pillai sir, okay. So we have sort of, so I'm giving you a very sort of elementary or a student kind of answer, not that experienced answer, but we have demonstrated in the book how data inaccuracies have resulted in large federal transfers to Nagaland. And this if you calculate the amount of excess transfers, it is almost as large as the state's budget for a year. So these, it may be useful at some level. It may not be entirely not useful. Now, with regard to Aadhaar, even if we achieve 100% Aadhaar enrollment, it requires a lot of care to compare Aadhaar data with vis-a-vis population. Reason being, Aadhaar for a children below a certain age, Aadhaar enrollment may not be full, despite it being showing 100%. And secondly, we are not sure, if suppose an elderly dies, whether Aadhaar is actually giving us a cumulative data, or they are actually correcting for these number of deaths. So there are these kind of issues which we have to see before we can actually compare. But thank you for your questions.
Can I just come in, Manoj, on the
Please.
question that
Yeah.
Anushka asked?
Yeah, please, sir, go ahead.
Anushka, as far as your question is concerned, the one thing that you should actually note is that the kind of data problems that we are discussing get magnified the lower you go in the level of aggregation. So at high levels of aggregation, let's say at the national level or the broad area level, regional level, the problems will not be that large. But as you zone downwards to a small state or the district or sub-district, the problems can explode on you. So everything depends. So I think the census is perfectly okay if you're using it at an aggregative level, at the larger national level. But when you're looking at relatively small areas, you have to be much more careful.
Okay, next set of questions, please.
Yes, may I call on Karthik Quatra to unmute his mic and ask his question, please?
Good evening, everyone. My question is to Professor Vikas. I've not read the book yet, but I've been a student of Professor Vikas, so I know a bit about the research. So, Professor Vikas, my question is that this question of frame non-coverage, in your experience, have you also observed this in non-peripheral areas? So in the case of Nagaland, we understand because it's topological reasons, and the idea was that beyond a certain kilometers from the road, they were not going to survey those areas. Do you see non-coverage in the mainland as well? That's the first question. And the second one is that if there is time, could you also explain the first slide after the key insights, which showed the dissection at the different levels and how it exposes the errors. My second question is to Professor Pranab Sen. So I work with GIS maps a lot in data science. And so there is no public data for 2011 village maps at all. And as you mentioned that it will be sort of really useful, it could be crucial for the census data collection process. So my question, given that you've served as a member of the NSC, do you have any understanding why the Survey of India is either not collecting or publishing the 2011 village maps? That's it. Thanks.
Next question is from Poonam Singh.
Good evening, panelists. My question relates to methodology. So what I could figure out from the discussion here is that a lot of socio-economic and say political considerations, lead to this data manipulation, or if I can say wrong reporting of data that is happening, and they seem to be localized. Some of the examples that Vikas gave, for instance, in terms of, while in Nagaland, a consensus could emerge, but that is not true for Manipur and Jammu Kashmir, and probably in central parts of India, the problem would be very different. So from a methodology perspective, is there any learning in terms of, training the investigator so that these kind of problems can be addressed from their side? So that's the question. Thank you.
Poonam's was the last question of the evening. So maybe you can address them.
Yeah, please go ahead. No more questions. Right?
Question about your frame non-coverage in the non-peripheral areas. We have not really come across any serious case of non-coverage in the frame non-coverage in the non-peripheral areas. So, and should I also respond to Poonam Singh's question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, very briefly, when Professor Mahalanobis and others laid the foundation of the Indian statistical system, they laid the foundation of a decentralized statistical system where the federal units had a substantial say. In fact, even in 1951 census, the state of Bengal could ask questions in addition to the main census. Right now, over the years, the decentralized system has decayed, and with that, all the learning and understanding of local level has also, withered away. Unless we rebuild, because India is a federal country, unless we rebuild the federal structure of our statistical institutions, there will continue to be problems of the kind that we see. I mean, it's not that the problem on Nagaland is not seen there, or some other problem is not seen in Nagaland. The problem is that each locality has a different political economic structure, and therefore they have different problems. Our surveyors and data agencies have to understand the political economic logic of the system, and then they'll be able to see through the local specificities in each case.
Right. As we have come to the end of the session, if we could go towards closing comments from the panelists.
Yeah, maybe may I request now, for the panelists to take about a minute or so, each of them, if they have any closing comments, as well as the authors also.
Well, there is one unanswered question, which was on the 2011 Survey of India village maps. And the question that was asked is whether this would impact the 2023 census. And the answer is yes. And the reason was asked that why has it not happened? Now, the fact of the matter is that an issue that was raised, at which level is data being manipulated? Is it being done at the collection stage, at the compilation stage, at the processing stage, or at the release? Is really an important issue. Now, as far as the Survey of India information is concerned, it is the real problem is going to crop up. The base data, I don't think, is an issue at all. What is really the issue is how it is being put together for release. And I think that is where the politics of data really come in. And this is a very, very serious issue. Because in the absence of our maps and accurate maps, any other exercise becomes pretty much a waste of time.
Yeah, any other closing comments?
Mr. Hazarika?
Yeah, very quickly. I think that a lot of it comes back to a non-quantifiable quality, which is trust. You know, do the respondents you go to actually trust you? Will you, because they're sharing very personal, intimate, detailed information about themselves to a stranger? And often they get fed up of being surveyed. In small places, the same people get surveyed time and again. And then they say, you're the 10th person who's come in the last 4 months. Are you going to pay us something or what? Why you're getting all our data for free? You'll put it out in the public domain and we get nothing out of it. So it's a question of really patience, trust, and integrity. The integrity is, I think, both Professor Panda, the authors, Professor Sen and Rukmini have spoken about. Really, trust is connected to integrity. And the integrity of the statistical exercise is connected to the integrity of the persons who are handling that entire process, ensuring that there is no manipulation. Because several states we have seen extensive manipulation. Thank you.
Yeah, Rukmini, anything you would like to add?
Just a quick line, which is to say that in addition to Mr. Hazarika's, use of the word trust, I'd also say that one of the things I've picked up from this is the importance of empathy. And I don't, I just mean in terms of understanding why people are taking the decisions that they do, even if they are to do with fraud. Understanding the reasons for that, I mean, apart from being empathetic, it just helps us fix them and helps us move forward.
Yeah, authors, Ankush or Vikas, anything?
Just there are two questions which I want to very briefly answer. Professor Manfred Holler had asked if a similar analysis can be done for the European Union. There was some, analysis done for the distribution of Marshall funds in Europe, in which there were irregularities. So some maybe that. The other thing, that I want to address is that Professor Narendra Pani has asked for decomposition of non-sampling errors. We actually do a decomposition between frame non-coverage and sample non-coverage, and we also we could not go ahead because of space constraints, but we can also look at other observational and non-response errors as well. So to some extent we can do a decomposition, but as Ankush pointed out, beyond a point it would be difficult to very precisely quantify these errors. The last thing that I want to address is Mr. Gopal Pillai's point about the bureaucracy has always known this, but there's lack of political will. I completely agree with him that most of the things that we as academics sometimes figure out from distance is known to bureaucracy, and there is a problem political will. However, we believe that when we do this kind of work, we are actually expanding the domain of public debate, and perhaps these public debates can in turn exert pressure on the politicians. If we are not going to discuss them at all, they won't be held accountable for this, in any case. So, but perhaps if we discuss this, and today we come together here and go back to our respective fields and you discuss it further, maybe eventually over time there might be political pressure to change these things.
Ankush, any point?
No, I don't have much to add.
Okay, then, I have only one thing to say, that this is going to be a reference book for researchers for quite a long time. And generally academicians and researchers, they didn't want to enter into these fields except to write maybe small pieces. Because you have been able to write a book that is inspiring and that has been very successful, it might inspire others also to write similar things. There might be other stories, and that will be a good contribution by these two young people. Lastly, I would like to thank the Bangalore International Center for having this panel discussion on the book. And it has indeed been a very inspiring evening. Thank you. Over to Lekha.
Thank you, Professor Panda. Thank you, Ankush and Vikas, for writing that book that has thrown so much light, and thanks to the panelists for talking about it so lucidly and giving us access to something that may have been a little bit too dense for a general interest audience like most of us. We learned about developing a healthy skepticism about the quality of data and about vested interests in manipulating data. We hope we will get to correctional measures in the system so that we all have confidence in a shared truth on which decisions can be taken. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the audience for making time, and thank you to everyone on the panel to taking the time and joining us. Good night, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you, Lekha.
Yeah, thank you.
BIC.
Thank you very much, all the panelists and all the participants. Thank you for your time. We are grateful.
Thanks,
and
Kamal.
also BIC.
My side as well.
Thank you, Ankush and Vikas, because without you, we wouldn't have the discussion.
Yes, quite.
You're the reason. Thank you all.
Yeah, keep it up.
Yeah. Look for the next book.